Welcome to this new podcast series titled Talking Book Publishing with Steve and Tara. Hello, my name is Tara Brabazon.
My name is Steve Redhead.
And welcome to our third podcast in this series of the writing of a book. Is this the time for you to write a book in your academic career? And this third podcast explores the relationship between refereed articles and books. So this is a big deal in many ways in our environment that has research assessment exercises, mechanisms by which research is measured. An article is a very simple, quick and easy way to capture a measurement of scholarship, particularly through citations. So therefore the status of the book in these types of cultures I think is quite ambivalent. So Steve, what do you think is the relationship between a refereed article and a book? Is there any? Are they different forms and genres and should be treated as such?
Well, I would say that both, certainly in academic book terms, both are part of refereeing processes. The refereeing processes are different, but they're both part of refereeing processes. And I, as well as writing books and refereed articles, I'm still heavily involved in refereeing for books and refereeing for articles, for journals or chapters in books or whatever. And I think that has to be stated quite clearly that there is actually, you're always having to go through these processes. I think one of my arguments would be that for both those processes, people really have to be very careful when they are doing that refereeing. And I was saying before about in one of our other conversations about the love of the book. And I'm always very careful, particularly when I'm looking at a book proposal or actually looking at the book itself when I'm refereeing in that way, because I know how much emotional investment has been put in. Yeah. I'm not saying that emotional investment and indeed career investment hasn't been put into refereed articles, but my argument is really that there is something different about the book and the article, even though both are subject to refereeing processes.
Yeah.
And it's partly to do with that emotional love of the book, which I talked about.
Yeah, it's a question of scale, I think. That's the key relationship. But also, can I push you on this? I also think it's a question of the project itself. That I think at the start of when one is writing a project, you have a sense of how big it is. That a refereed article is more bounded, if I can use that word. The boundaries are clearer. So, that's when I suppose the research questions become important. This is what I am investigating. So it's clearly separated from a whole series of other fields. Whereas a book, I think, it is making a bigger statement. It allows you to stretch, perhaps be more interdisciplinary, engage a whole series of different approaches, modes, methods, and different scholars. So I think there is really a question of scale in terms of content as well.
Yes, I think that certainly can be true. I think there is, the way you've described it, does suggest that these are different kinds of projects, and they very often are. Yeah. One is bounded and one is less bounded.
So when I think any of us are starting a new project or something significant, it is worth just taking a breath and spending 20 minutes and saying, is this a discrete entity in and of itself? Or could there be 5 or 6 other bits that could come to it later that may mean this article could then become a book? Something really to think about.
But sometimes I think that is still a pragmatic thing. I mean, I've been involved in a huge number of external examining projects for PhDs around the world, and very often you get into discussions with other examiners and maybe even the supervisors about the PhD student either writing the PhD up as a book, which is always possible, or putting into various journals refereed articles based on it. And that's in some ways a pragmatic decision. They're not necessarily completely different projects.
Oh, that's absolutely right. But I do think you save time in the long term by working out what these variables are. Is this an article? Is this a book? And of course, I'll foreshadow this. That's becoming quite important to me because I've made a mistake on that a few times, which we may come back to in a sec. But let's go through, if we can list for listeners, what are the key differences between a refereed article and a book. I'll start. I think there is a difference in the scale of content, the scale of scholarship that is consulted. Often a refereed article perhaps has one method, whereas a book will require mixed methods. There's also the time commitment. So a refereed article, depending on the scale of the research, can probably be done and dusted in a 3-month period. Whereas, with a book, from go to woe, a year you're doing pretty well, I think. So I've started.
And also, I think the book actually has very often a different audience. The refereed article is just about always a specialist thing. And the point partly about the book project, which is different, is that very often that is reaching media, national and international, indeed local media, in a way that a refereed article isn't. And it spins off that. I've very often had that, partly because I've kind of just hit things at the right time, but particularly the work we did on Acid House and rave culture 20-odd years ago. Even now, the 25th anniversary of all of this is coming back, and my books, and particularly books, still get talked about.
Yeah, the articles wouldn't. The books tend to survive. The books move digitally or analogue. They move through time, and they are that statement that I talked about in an earlier podcast.
But that's partly because they had a more general readership in the first place, and it would be journalists rather than academics that would review it, whereas specifically journal articles, refereed articles, are very often just read by other academics.
Oh, Steve, I think that's crucial. That audience does matter. And if I can use one example from my own work that, actually is being proofed on the floor in our lounge room as we speak, the new book, Digital Wine, that I wrote with Mick Winter and Bryn Gandy, this is a book that has an academic audience. So it is about QR codes and the use of technology, particularly in primary production and promoting. So it's Creative Industries 101, linking tertiary and the primary sector. So it has the academic audience, but it is also a guide for small and boutique winemakers in how to use technology. So whereas a refereed article will be very much, here is the QR code and how it is emerging through the wine industries, this also has the how-to guide within it. So multiple audiences come to a book in a way that doesn't occur, I would argue, perhaps with refereed articles. I think that's brilliant. So a difference of audience. Do you think we've covered everything?
Those are mostly, I think they're the essential things.
And the commitment of time, I think, does matter. I know we were underestimating time, but in the busy academic life that exists at the moment, each of you who are listening to this podcast has to decide, what do you need at this point of your career too? Like, do you need sort of the easy hit of a refereed article, tick that box? Or in your promotion mechanism, are you thinking, right, well, if I'm going from senior lecturer to associate professor, or in the UK, senior lecturer to reader, I would argue you ain't going to get there unless you've got a book. And certainly at Murdoch University, it was avert. You haven't got a book, don't even bother going for an associate professorship. It is a statement of the field, I think. So they're differences. Last question on this particular topic about this relationship, Steve, and this is what I want to talk about, was the new type of books that are emerging, the short books that are emerging, particularly we're seeing through Elsevier, through Chandos, respect to all my colleagues at Chandos, and also at Springer. And to introduce this question, I'll actually explain the mistake I made when I confused refereed articles and books, and you were part of my resolution of this, so one of the advantages of being married to you. But in January this year, I was writing a book, I was writing an article. I thought it was an article on third-tier cities, and I thought I was going to work with you, and we were going to look at our third-tier cities and physical cultures, sporting cultures in small cities. And I thought, nice, discreet refereed article, off we go. So I started writing, and the sports stuff completely sort of got parked for a moment. So all the work we'd done on that was sort of gone. And I was just writing on these small cities. And before I knew it, I was at 35,000 words.
Yes, I think I read 18. A long article at 18. And I said you could put it into a journal as part 1 and part 2.
Yes. Now, but the interesting thing is I said to you in response to that, so I'd written it too long. The bottom line is I'd got it wrong. I was aiming to write a refereed article and it was at least double the length at the point Steve read it. And he said, oh, look, maybe we could go part 1 and part 2. But of course, journals don't do that anymore. No. In the old days, they used, not when I say old days, 10 years ago, they used to have a part 1 and a part 2. So Apogee used to be making a big point and you'd have a point 1 and a part 1 and a part 2.
Yeah, that's gone.
Now that's gone. So I thought, well, I'm really stuffed now. What am I going to do? And I suddenly realised the nature of digitisation and the changes to publishing is that new, shorter books are emerging. So instead of having to get to 60, 80 or 100,000 words, and I'd just written a 100,000 word book, it was published some months before with Digital Dieting, this one ended up about 42,000 words. It is called Unique Urbanity, and it's currently being assessed by Springer as a short book. So, Steve, what do you think about digitisation and the new publishing, and indeed these new forms like short books that are available to us?
Yeah, I've always liked short books, I must admit. And writers who I've written about, people like Paul Virilio, for example, has written shorter books as he's got older, and now he's in his 80s, he's writing even shorter books. But the interesting thing is that someone like one of his publishers, Semiotext in the United States, has had these kind of little black book series, not always black, but actually put out ideas in short books for decades, and they've been incredibly influential. I remember writing to Sylvain Lottringer of Semiotext at one time saying, I don't know whether you really understand what a great idea this was. And they really pioneered it. And now digitisation allows for much more of that, I think. I think it's a great idea.
I do too. And of course, the other thing I should mention is, of course, Penguin were great pioneers in this area too. We've got all those fantastic great thinker series. Wonderful. We would have hundreds of them sitting in our front room from Penguin. So I agree with you. They're fantastic to read because it's again about understanding the boundaries around that subject. And for those of us that may not have 100,000 words on a topic, but have a hell of a lot more than 8,000 words, what do we do? Unless we could get to Semiotext, which is a very specialist publisher, particularly for French theorists, or have that more populist ring through Penguin, what do we do?
And I think it also addresses what I would call accelerated culture, which is partly to do with all sorts of multimedia platforms, but also partly to do with the anti-intellectual culture that we've now got globally, and also in opposition. And intellectual culture, but partly because of the global anti-intellectual culture, that people don't read as many books, and certainly long books, as they used to. So the idea of at least reading a short book is an important cultural practice.
I agree with that. And so there is perhaps, maybe the days are over where an E.P. Thompson, The Making of the English Working Class, may be more difficult to get through publishers. But there is something great, and that's why I maybe don't even read it as anti-intellectual. I see what you're saying. I read it as something really positive. We've got new modes of reading and writing and publishing that are emerging that are also great for our new platform. So if you are reading on an iPad or a Kindle, then it is. I mean, I like a lot of listeners probably in those early Kindles, I was reading a lot of books, long books on the Kindle. And, I don't think that was a very comfortable thing to do, to be frank with you. But these smaller books are fantastic to read on these emerging platforms, backlit or otherwise. So I think we've got this great moment of audience, publisher, reader, writer and technology all coming together to create this new genre or oeuvre of the short book. So do consider that as well when you've got the will I write a refereed article, will I write a long book? Always remember now there's quite a fertile middle ground.
Absolutely. I think that will carry on. I think that's something genuinely new.
Fantastic. So I hope that's helped you. We'll now move on to our next podcast. You ready to go, Steve?
Yep.
Thank you for listening to this podcast series on Talking Book Publishing with Steve and Tara. For further information, please feel free to contact us at Charles Sturt University.